Hello, marvelous muffins. Do you like cats? I like cats. They're soft and squishy and delicious. My brother also likes cats, and it just so happens that he has a cat and requested that I build a hobbit door for that little cat. So, first things first, my brother and his wife chose the wood that I would be using for the door, which is paddock and wenge. I then took a bunch of boards, I cut them into little smaller boards, and then I glued all of the smaller boards together to make a main kind of square base that I'll be attempting to cut the door out of, essentially. Some quick sanding, and then we should probably mark out where we want the door to actually be. Now, I've got an idea for how I can make the door be basically seamless in terms of how it opens and closes. Because what I want is it to basically be able to open and return to a center point without much trouble. So what I'm going to do is I will drill up a big hole into it, not go all the way through, and then I can insert a dowel into there and then hopefully put a spring into kind of halfway into the hole that will be there. And that should maybe work. We'll see later in the video. Drilling the actual hole for the dowel turned out to be quite the annoying ordeal. The initial drill bit I used, the little tiny guy there, that went in just fine, but the longer drill bit, despite being new, did not want to go through the wood. It burned its way entirely through the wood. So it ended up melting the glue that was holding together the different pieces of wood, and at one point I put some water onto the drill bit to try and cool it down and clean it off, and the water actually boiled the next time that I tried to drill through the thing. So long story short, the drill bit did eventually go through, but it did melt the glue and the plank fell off, and I had to clean it all up, and then I had to repair it again. With the happy hole of joy drilled, I moved on to the next step, which was to cut out kind of the main body, a big circle. So I just took a jig and used a router and cut out a happy little circle. So that's kind of the main body, sanded down and everything. But the thing is, the door is not actually just this piece. The door has a frame, and then it has the actual door inside of the door, and then that door is actually going to go inside of another bigger door. So it's basically kind of like when Ezekiel saw the angel with the wheels and the eyes on the wheels. Anyway, so yeah, that's what I'm doing here. I'm cutting out the actual main door of the door. And as you just saw, once I cut the frame out, it immediately broke, and then I had to repair it. And also later on in the video, I will have to repair it again, but don't worry about that. You can see what I did wrong here. I didn't clamp it at all. I just put the glue on and then just squished it together and hoped for the best, which, as it turns out, is not a recommended strategy. You should plan ahead and not do what I did. In order for the door to open correctly, I needed the frame and the door itself to both have some kind of chamfer or roundover of some kind. So that's what I'm doing here, just routing the edge of the actual frame, which ends up kind of damaging it, as you can tell by my disappointed reaction here. Okay, so, this makes me sad, but I suppose it's just tolerable. I mean, hobbit doors are supposed to be rustic anyway, so it's okay. I'll sand it out and try and improve it a bit, but just have to keep going. The router bit I was using didn't quite work out how I was hoping it would, so I tried this one, but it also didn't really have the cut that I needed. At first I thought a roundover bit would be the most appealing, but it seems that I don't really have those sitting around, so I instead looked for a chamfer bit. This bit was much better, but still wasn't sufficient, and also, while I was cutting, I managed to snap the frame in half again. While I was thinking through how to repair the frame again, I also had this issue where every time I would go anywhere near the holes where the dowel is going to be positioned, I would accidentally cut deeper into the material than I was intending to. So my solution here was basically to wrap up some paper, shove it into the hole, and then put a little bit of glue on it to solidify it, and then I could go over it with the router without risk of damaging it. God willing, this will not not mess everything up. So, all right, I might want to plug it in. This technique worked quite marvelously. So if you're having any similar trouble where your router is basically cutting into the area where there's a hole beneath it, then just do that. Take some paper, wrap it up, put it in the hole, glue it on there, and then you remove it just by shoving it out with a dowel. With that dealt with, let's move on to repairing the frame. So what I did here is obviously first sanded off any remaining glue, and then took a plank and put it basically in between the frame prongs, I guess you would say. And then I put some glue on, and then I simply squished it together with the vise. And this worked perfectly fine, didn't do any extra damage, all good. You may be shocked to hear, but there was yet another issue with the project, which was that the door basically needed to be thinner in order to open correctly. So, for that ends, I ordered a big chonker of a router bit in order to thin out the main door of the actual door. I ran into a problem immediately in the sense that the faceplate of the router was simply too small, and the chamfer bit was simply too girthy, but it didn't matter, I simply drilled right through the faceplate. This, as you may have guessed, is not a recommended technique. In fact, it made the entire garage smell like molten plastic for about 3 hours. That's probably not much of an issue for me in particular because I've been working in recycling plastic for about 6 or 7 years now, so I'm probably like immune to plastic fumes at this point. Yeah, or I'm filled with microplastics. One of those. Come to think of it, before I worked in plastic recycling, I did blacksmithing as a hobby, specifically using coal to power the forge. I'm sure that none of this has had any repercussions on my mental health. Anyway, next I needed to forge a spring to try and make a mechanism so the door would return to its middle point in the main frame of the door. So here's what I need to work with. Essentially, I've got this first attempt at making a conical spring, which seems fine. However, I need to find a way to actually secure the spring inside of the frame. Now, one of them was to just try and glue it, but the issue there is I'd basically have one shot to get to that right, so I didn't think that would work very well. And the other idea was to try and take a screw and wrap a spring around that screw and then put that into the actual hole itself. Before I could consider any of those options, I needed to actually test and make sure that the spring I made would actually work and be springy enough and not break. So first I needed to harden it and then I needed to temper it. Well, if it worked, then it would be springy. And if I did something wrong, then it will break. It appears to have broken. So at this point, my theory was maybe I hadn't given it enough time to kind of cool gently. And so I made another spring and I tried again, this time allowing it to cool for like 2 hours. Okay, just squishing it, it's fine enough. Okay. Okay. Well, definitely the better results for sure, but is it enough? Is it, if I push it, I guess I have to push it for the sake of the test. How far can it go? Clearly not very far. So, that one didn't work either. So, once again, I had a new theory. Perhaps it needed to be cooled in oil, since there are many forms of alloy steel which require to be cooled in oil at very specific temperatures. And I figured an industrial-produced spring probably needs oil to be cooled. So I tried that. And that also was insufficient. So, for the sake of time, I made like 4 or 5 springs, and all of them had some kind of problem. I eventually made one that would, in theory, work. However, it was too wide to actually be practical to work. So I realized after all of that, I could just buy a spring that would just work. You're probably wondering why on earth I didn't think of that in the first place, and the answer is simple. Sometimes I'm dumb. I don't know why you didn't just tell me that I could buy a spring. That would have saved a lot of time if you had done that. But anyway, let's finish drilling out the hole and continue with the project. As you can see, I wanted to use a securing pin in order to put the spring in place. And in order to cut the groove for that, I used what my contractor friend used to call a wibbly wobbly. It's actually called an oscillating saw, but I like wibbly wobbly better. With the dowel painted and ready to go, I put the lower spring into the hole and I secured it with some JB weld. Now, it's important to note here, I think if you're going to do this project yourself, you should probably get more powerful springs, which most likely means you will need to make the hole for the dowel larger. Now next, I would recommend that you mark the dowel so that you know exactly where the grooves will be able to slot into the spring. Super glue is wonderful, and therefore I used its wonder in order to secure the dowel into the final door frame, which is great. Okay, so the main body's basically done. Next up, I did some final sanding, and then after that, the final coating of polyurethane. This project started like months ago, and finally the actual door was complete. But of course, there's still more work to do. I needed to mark out the actual main big door, and then use the router to carve out a big circle that needed to be precise enough that the little hobbit door would actually fit inside of it. Once carved, I tested the fit of the door, and of course, this happened. That was moderately annoying, but not too much of an issue. I simply put it back together with some glue and didn't even have to use any clamps. Next up, I needed to sand and stain the actual hole that the hobbit door would be going in, and then it's time to put it in. It didn't take very much glue to secure the hobbit door, so cleanup was quite simple actually. After that, I needed to transport the door to my brother's place. So first I wrapped it up to make sure that the hobbit door wouldn't get damaged, and then naturally I tossed it into my limo and drove it on over. Once there, we reconnected the door to the frame, which is really satisfying. Look at this. Look at the happy, satisfying process. And finally, the door is done. Okay, let's get some nice pictures, and then I want to review some tips and tricks that could be useful. Alright, thank you wonderful people for watching. Now, for the people who are more serious about trying to build this thing, I'd say it's probably best not to have like multiple pieces of wood put together to build it. I think that reduces its structural strength. So perhaps just have one piece of wood as kind of the main frame. I would also recommend having the frame be thicker. Also, make sure you know the thickness of the door before you start designing the hobbit door in the first place, because I didn't actually realize that the door it was going into was quite a bit thicker than the actual hobbit door. Also, if you want to do the dowel technique that I did, if you can find stronger springs, definitely go for that, because I found that to be a bit annoying that it doesn't fully swing back the way I would like it to. So definitely account for that. Other than that, I think you are smart enough to figure it out yourself. So thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.